Okay, so let's do a meditation related to this first type of selflessness. So begin by making yourself comfortable. Try to sit in a position that is comfortable, but that doesn't mean lazy, slouching. So it's good to try to sit up straight. That helps the mind to be more clear and focused. But at the same time, try to be relaxed rather than tense. And let your mind relax by letting go of or putting aside any thoughts that might be floating around in your mind that are not related to what we are doing here. So memories from the past or plans for the future, which can include tonight, once we finish here, what you're going to do. So that's not here yet. So bring your mind back from the future, from the past, to right here, right now. But in order to do this meditation, I will ask you to bring up something from the past, preferably something recent, some experience in which you had some strong feelings, strong emotion. So you may have been angry or excited if something wonderful happened, or feeling hurt, or feeling frightened, anxious. So some kind of emotional experience where you felt a strong emotion, and within that experience, as kind of behind or underneath the experience, is a feeling of I. The I who is angry or excited or frightened or upset, whatever. So try to bring up the memory of such an experience, but try to do it in such a way that you can kind of take a step back and look objectively at what was happening in your mind, in your experience. So what we want to pay attention to here isn't the emotion, it isn't the object that we're getting emotional about, but rather the feeling of an I who is experiencing that emotion. So see if you can identify that. See if you can catch a glimpse of that sense of an I. So now we're going to explore or analyze, investigate, to see if this I has these three qualities: permanence, being unitary or partless, being independent. To see if it can exist in those three ways. The first is permanent. Permanent here means unchanging. It can also mean eternal, forever, always there. But the real meaning of permanence in Buddhism is doesn't change moment by moment. It's always the same, always exactly the same, static, frozen, unchanging. Just check to see if the sense of I that you have is like that. Is it unchanging, or does it change? Sometimes we might have a sense of permanence about our I. For example, we say things like, when I was a child. So it may seem as if the I of right now, this moment, who's saying that, is exactly the same as the I that was a child many years ago. But is that so? Are we exactly the same now as we were when we were a child? Is there something within us that is always the same, moment after moment, day after day, year after year, all through our life, and doesn't change at all? So you might not have fully answered that question, but we can put it aside for now. You can always take it up again later. So now we'll move on to the second quality of this type of self, and that is unitary or whole or partless. So is your self, the I, like that? Is it just one thing that has no parts? And if that was the case, we couldn't talk about different parts of ourselves. We couldn't talk about different parts of our body, for example, or different parts of our mind, different parts of our personality. There would just be this one whole, indivisible, partless self or I. So does that make sense? Is that possible? That the I exists in that way? So again, you might not have completed thinking about that, investigating that. You can always continue later if you wish, but we're going to move on now to the third quality, which is independent. And independent can mean different things, but in this case it just means independent of causes and conditions. Being able to exist on its own without depending on other things. So if that was the case, if the I, me, was independent of causes and conditions, we could exist without our parents. We wouldn't need our mother and father in order to come into existence. We wouldn't need food and water and air. We wouldn't need doctors and medicine in order to exist. We would be able to exist completely independent of anything else, completely on our own, autonomous, self-contained. So just think about that and check to see if that is possible, if your I, yourself, is able to exist in that way. Also, if such an I did exist, an I that's permanent, unitary, and independent, then it would exist separate from our body and mind, our aggregates. So, is that realistic? Is that possible? Because if it was possible, we could have our body and mind in one place and our I, our self, somewhere else. For example, we could leave our body and mind sitting here in this room, and our I, our self, could go downstairs to the coffee shop and have something to eat and drink. Or the other way around. Our I could be here in this room, our body and mind could go downstairs to the coffee shop. So is that possible? So now, make a conclusion based on what you've thought about in this meditation. Are you able to conclude that a permanent, unitary, independent self exists, or doesn't exist, or you're not sure? Maybe you need to think about it more, investigate it more. And just come to whatever conclusion makes sense for you at this point in time. So you may not have had enough time to really explore that question, but that was just to give you some idea of how you could do such an investigation. Although they say that to do a meditation on selflessness or emptiness, and for it to really work, to be effective, the very first step needs to be what they call identifying the object of negation. Probably heard that term before, object of negation.
לזהות את אובייקט השלילה. לזהות את אובייקט השלילה.
Yeah, the object of negation. So in this case, the object of negation would be that type of self, a permanent, unitary, independent self. Okay, so that's the thing that we are, like a target. You know, you're, what's the word? An archer, somebody who shoots arrows. If you're shooting arrows, yeah. So you need a target. Okay, so usually this big round thing with rings and so on, and you're shooting your arrows at that and trying to hit the very middle, the bullseye. So to do this kind of meditation, we need that target. We need that sense of a self, and I mean, it's something in our experience, not just something, you know, we create, but, you know, like I say, when we get emotional, when we get upset about something, angry about something, frightened or whatever, there's some strong emotion. So usually part of that experience, underneath it or behind it, there's this I, this feeling of I, real I. So we need to catch that, to catch a glimpse of that. What does that look like? How does that look? And so on. So normally this is explained in the teachings on emptiness, where they're talking about a much more subtle sense of self, an inherently existing and independently existing self. So that's much more subtle. That's like the very little, you know, one of the inner dolls of the Russian dolls, right? But to get to that, it can be quite hard if you don't first go through the bigger ones, right? You have to take away the big ones on the outside before you can get to that small one inside. But anyway, they say if we don't catch a glimpse of that, the sense of self that we have within our experience, the emotional, sometimes people use the term the emotional I. You know, that expression, the emotional I, the I that gets emotional, right? We know that one, right?
It's one that's being insulted or praised too much?
Yeah, yeah. We get emotional. I really exist. And yeah, so we have to be able to catch a glimpse of that, and then use, you know, have that as the target, and then check: does it really exist the way it appears? So they say just to catch that first step of identifying the object of negation, getting a sense of that real sense of self, that itself is quite hard, quite challenging. And actually, one of my teachers explained something that made a lot of sense to me. Because earlier I mentioned, they say that we need to do purification, like to get an understanding of emptiness, we need to do purification. So this teacher explained that why we need to do purification is because when we're trying to do a meditation on emptiness or selflessness, if we have a lot of delusions, a lot of disturbing emotions, disturbing thoughts, a lot of stuff, negative stuff in our mind, then it's very hard to catch this false I. And he says he used the analogy. He says, like if you're trying to catch a thief, let's say there's a thief who comes out maybe at night, you know, early in the morning, middle of the night, comes out and goes into houses and steals things and robs things. And when the police try to catch this person has a lot of hiding places. Maybe they're in a, you know, part of the town where there's lots of, you know, doorways and alleyways and cellars, so the person can hide very easily, and then it's hard to find them. But on the other hand, if you could get this person in the middle of a big football field, there's no place to hide, no place this person can, you know, hide, then it's very easy to catch him. So he said, in the same way, when we're trying to catch this false sense of self, if there's lots of hiding places, the hiding places would be our disturbing emotions, our disturbing thoughts, our negative experiences. So the eye will slip away and hide among these things, and then it's very hard to catch them. Whereas if we can purify, clear our mind of a lot of that stuff, not all, but make our mind more clear, then it becomes like the big football field. And then it's easier to catch this false sense of self or I. So when I heard that explanation, then it really made sense. Why? Because otherwise I couldn't understand. What's the point? Doing prostrations? How is that going to help me to understand emptiness? So that helped me anyway to understand the importance of doing purification. Also, concentration. It's also important to be able to have good concentration. Because if you don't have good concentration, if your mind is just running away every 2 seconds, you can't even stay focused on your meditation. And again, it's very hard. Like the police, they keep getting distracted, looking at pretty girls or looking at billboards or whatever, so then they can lose the thief. So again, we need to have the ability to keep our mind focused.
Why is the metaphor for football? Because when you see all the disturbing emotions and then you can see the eye very strongly? Why is it?
No.
When you purify, you see all your negative emotions, that's why?
Well, you clear away hiding places. What he said was, if we have a lot of disturbing emotions, a lot of attachment and anger and so on, and these are like hiding places for this false sense of self. It easily hides among our disturbing emotions, and it's hard to catch. So when our mind is more clear, not so many disturbing emotions, it's more like the big empty field, no place to hide. What did you think I was saying?
Because I thought it's full of football of people.
No. Okay, maybe football field was mine, but I was just a big empty field.
Field without the football.
Yeah, no football, no football.
Now I can understand it. Because I'm a man, when I see football field, I see many people around. So
Okay.
Against Germany.
Bayern München against Liverpool. Okay, now I get it.
Now you get it. Okay, good.
Now it makes sense.
Okay. So that's pretty much what I was planning to talk about today. Next time we'll go on to look at a more, somewhat more subtle sense of self, the inner doll. Not that we finished with this one, there's still a lot more we could do to talk about this one, but I wanted to leave you some time to ask questions.
Can I say a remark? That when you make a meditation, I really never touch such a silent place like you do it.
You what?
When you guide a meditation, it is such a silent place and beautiful place to be in. When you guide it, it's beautiful. It's very, very silent. It's very, very calm. As if you take us to a small, cozy place, which is very nice. That's what I felt. So I said, as we share it with the others.
Yeah.
It's a very special place. I never really touched that silent place in meditation, and I take it home with me. And when I go to the same place that you take us. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
How do you combine this topic with Western psychology? Because I think that sometimes in psychology or in movement, we're trying to לחזק, strength the eye and make it more solid, right? And now in here we're trying to, how Lemo says? To dissolve the eye. How do I bridge? How do I make a bridge?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because actually this is something I was going to talk about today and then I forgot. But there's a lot that could be said about that. But there's an American man, psychotherapist, I'm not sure which tradition. His name is Jack Engler. And he did his PhD thesis on Satipatthana meditation. So he actually interviewed some of the great masters of the Vipassana tradition who've already passed away now. And anyway, so he's got a foot in both worlds. He's a psychotherapist, he's also a meditator and meditation teacher. And a number of years ago, I can send you this article if you're interested, it's quite interesting. He wrote an article in which he said that it's really, he faces this difficulty in his work as a psychotherapist. He's trying to, I don't remember the exact words, but it's like what you said, you know, build up the ego. People who don't have a healthy sense of self, people who are schizophrenic or whatever, you know, they're fragmented. I don't remember the right words. Fragmented. Everyone. Okay. Anyway, so he's trying to help them to have a healthy, cohesive sense of self, and then his other hat is meditation teacher, teaching Buddhist meditation. He's trying to help people deconstruct the sense of self. So he said for him this has been like, what am I doing? And so he wrote this whole article about his thoughts and so on, and he came to the conclusion, and he stated it in one sentence. He says, you have to be somebody before you can be nobody. Yeah. And this became, it's actually led to a lot of controversy. A lot of other people who had similar, there's a lot of people like this in America, people like Jack Kornfield, for example, people who are both psychotherapists but also meditation teachers, you know. So they had, Mark Epstein is another one. So they have different opinions about this. And I think some of the, I don't know, criticism is the right word, but comments about this was that it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Like, you don't have to have a total cohesive sense of self before you start deconstructing it, something like that. But anyway, this is an issue, and I tend to agree. I think it is important. And just to give some references, have you heard of Alex Berzin?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
So on Alex Berzin's website, he's got tons of stuff there. There's a transcript of a course that he gave in Latvia a few years ago. And I don't remember the title of the course, but it was something like how to build up a healthy sense of self. How to build up a healthy sense of self. And he said that, I mean, he agreed basically with Jack Engler, you know, that you do need to have a healthy sense of self. And he said also in the Tibetan tradition, it's said that you shouldn't teach emptiness to children, to teenagers, also to people who are seriously emotionally disturbed and do not have a healthy sense of self. This is because if from the beginning you start to deconstruct any sense of self, when these people don't have a constructive, healthy sense of the conventional self, they're left with nothing. And this is very damaging.
This is what Buddha did.
Now, let me finish. So Alex Berzin said that in the Lamrim, the stages of the path to enlightenment, actually emptiness comes right at the end. It's taught right at the end. And before that, he explained it how the previous topics help you construct a healthy sense of self. For example, the precious human rebirth. That's one of the first topics. Yeah, how fortunate we are to have this human life, this human body with all these good conditions and so on and so forth. So that definitely builds up. I mean, if you believe it, you can believe it, it builds up a healthy sense of it. And so on and so forth. And then karma, okay, we are the creators of our own karma. We are responsible. If we want happiness, we need to create good karma. If we don't want suffering, we need to avoid bad karma. So again, that reinforces a healthy sense of self. I can, you know, I'm not helpless, you know, at the mercy of the universe or some God, but it's in my hands. I can create the causes of happiness. I can avoid the causes of suffering. I can purify bad karma and so on. So again, And then, of course, bodhicitta. I mean, the whole thing about bodhicitta, being a bodhisattva, I'm going to become enlightened to help all sentient beings. I mean, you have to have a strong, healthy sense of self to take on that kind of commitment, that kind of responsibility. If you think you're useless, you're hopeless, you're a disaster, you're nobody, you're nothing, how could you possibly develop bodhicitta? So anyway, it's an interesting article if you want to read the whole thing. He explains how all the various stages of the path build up and develop a healthy sense of self. And then right at the end, you have emptiness, where you're taking apart, tearing down, deconstructing the false sense of self. We're not getting rid of the healthy sense of self, the relative sense of self, the self that exists and that can follow the path, become enlightened, help sentient beings. So we're not throwing that one away, but it's the inflated, exaggerated, false sense of self. That's what we're deconstructing. So I think, I don't know if that's answering your question.
Yes, because maybe the whole subject of non-duality gets into to what you just said.
In what way?
It's not either that or that, but
It's interdependent.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no emptiness without
Conventional
the object
truth.
that is.
Yeah, there has to be a conventional self to say there's an emptiness of a self. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that the minute that you study and learn that the self or any other phenomena is dependent arising, then the emptiness is only a part of the whole thing, and it's not taking like the whole dependent arising self away. This is, I think that the thinking about dependent arising can help enhance a self-secured self, sort of, without making it permanent and
Yeah, so they say and this is Nagarjuna's approach, and the main founder of this tradition. Dependent arising and emptiness, they're like two sides of a coin, two sides of a hand. You can't have one without the other. So if you have a correct understanding of emptiness, you understand dependent arising. Not nihilism, not saying there's nothing there, there's nobody there, I'm not existing at all, but I do exist, but dependently. His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about meeting some Indian man one time. And this Indian man was asking, is it true there's no self? And His Holiness could see this guy was kind of shaking, actually physically, like really showing fear about the idea of no self. So His Holiness spoke to him about dependent arising. Things exist dependently, they depend. We're going to get to this later, how things exist dependently. But yeah, so it is important that we have a... And I just wanted to read something else. This is from Jack Kornfield. It's actually an extract from his book. I found it on his website, but it's from his book, Path with Heart. This is also dealing with this. He says, misconceptions about selflessness and emptiness abound, and such confusions undermine genuine spiritual development. Some people believe that they can come to selflessness by struggling to get rid of their ego-centered self. So they're like fighting my ego. I used to be like that. Others confuse the notion of emptiness with inner feelings of apathy, unworthiness, or meaninglessness that they have carried from a painful past into spiritual practice. We have described how students use emptiness as an excuse for withdrawal from life, saying it's all an illusion, trying to make a spiritual bypass around life's problems. Have you heard that term before? Spiritual bypass?
yes.
They use that in America. And you can do it with any religion, any kind of tradition, spirit.
What does it mean?
Looks like you're using religion, meditation, prayer, mantras, study, but you're using it to go around or try, it doesn't actually work, trying to avoid dealing with your problems. You just immerse yourself doing all these practices, but you're not really dealing with your stuff. But each of these diseases of emptiness misses the true meaning of emptiness and its liberating freedom. To try to get rid of the self, to purify, root out, or transcend all desire, anger, centeredness, I think it should be self-centeredness, to vanquish a self that is bad, is an old religious idea. This notion underlies the ascetic practices such as wearing hair shirts, extreme fasting, and self-mortification that are found in many traditions. You have this in Judaism? In Christianity, and people used to beat themselves with...
Judaism not much.
Not so much. Okay. Certainly Hinduism, they have... Yeah.
אין סוג כמו מצום. מה, ל"ג בעומר, יום כיפור, יש הרבה?
ל"ג בעומר?
ל"ג בעומר?
We have our Polish mothers, they do that.
לא באמת.
Anyway, sometimes such practices are used skillfully to induce altered states, but more often they only reinforce aversion. Worse, what comes with them is the notion that our body, our mind, our ego is somehow sinful, dirty, and deluded. I, the good part of me, must use these techniques to get rid of the self, the lower, bad part of me. But this can never work. It can never work because there is no self to get rid of. Well, I think he's talking about the false sense of self. And this is a really good thing to realize. You know, I used to think, oh, my ego, it's so bad, I have to get rid of my ego. And then at some point I realized, wait a minute. The Buddha said this, that doesn't even exist. That self doesn't even exist. It's not even there. It's just a mental fabrication. So the whole idea of fighting the ego, you know, is useless. We are a changing process, not a fixed being. There never was a self. Only our identification makes us think so. So while purification, kindness, and attention can certainly improve our habits, no amount of self-denial or self-torture can rid us of a self, for it was never there. When emptiness is confused with the deficiency and emotional poverty that many students bring to spiritual practice, it can perpetuate difficulties in other ways. As we have discussed, spiritual practice attracts a great many wounded people who are drawn to such practice for their own healing. Their numbers appear to be increasing. This was written in the 90s. It's probably even more now. The spiritual impoverishment of modern culture and the number of children raised without a nurturing and supportive family is growing. Divorce, alcoholism, traumatic or unfortunate circumstances, and painful child-rearing practices all can produce people who lack an inner sense of security and well-being. These children grow up to have adult bodies, but still feel like impoverished children. Many such adult children live in our society. Their pain is reinforced by the isolation and denial of feelings that is common in our culture. Many students have come to a spiritual practice with this problem, what some psychologists call a weak sense of self or a needy ego, with holes in their psyche and heart. This deficient sense of self is carried for years by our habits and bodily contractions, by the stories and mental images we have learned to tell ourselves. If we have a deficient sense of self, if we perennially negate ourselves, then we may easily confuse our inner poverty with selflessness and believe it to be sanctioned as the road to enlightenment. It's actually saying, you know, this sense of emptiness of a self, people might think that's the meaning of emptiness. So we have to be careful. This confusion of selflessness with inner poverty can be especially difficult for women. In our male-dominated culture, a woman can grow up feeling that she doesn't really count, that she will not amount to much in this man's world, that a woman's fate and work is not of value. This powerful conditioning can lead to an identity riddled with depression, fear, and a pervasive feeling of inadequacy. And he tells a story of one specific person. One woman who came to meditation practice feeling this way believed that she had a deep understanding of emptiness. For 5 years, she had studied with a young teacher who himself was confused about emptiness. When she came to see me, she talked about how deeply she had understood the teachings of selflessness and the impermanent, insubstantial nature of life. She said that whenever she practiced walking meditation or sitting meditation, she experienced selflessness very clearly. But to me, she simply looked unkempt and depressed. So I inquired further. I asked her to describe exactly how she experienced emptiness. Then I asked her to do her walking meditation in front of me and tell me precisely what she noticed. As she walked, I pointed out a heaviness in her walk and a contracted quality of her body. Soon she could see it too. As she explored her experience, it turned out not to be emptiness at all, but numbness and deadness. As we talked, it became clear that her body and feelings had been shut down for years. Her self-esteem was low, and she felt herself incapable of doing worthwhile things in the world. She confused this inner feeling with the profound teachings of insubstantiality. Sorting out this confusion began to bring her back to life. So,
the way he describes it, I'm wondering if while practicing emptiness, this woman felt that she was liberated from suffering. Because you read to us that for 5 years she was sure that she was, meditating on emptiness. And I wonder, did her suffering end, or did it?
Sounds like she was just numb.
She was depressed.
She was not in touch. She was like cut off, I think. Cut off from her feelings, cut off from her body.
So she couldn't experience happiness as well as...
Well, it doesn't sound like she is very happy, no.
So, if you practice for 5 years and you think it's emptiness, but you're not really getting anywhere.
Yeah. I also found this article on the website. Have you heard of Mark Epstein?
Yeah.
Mark Epstein? He's a psychiatrist or psychologist in New York. He's written a number of books, really clever titles like Thoughts Without a Thinker, How to Go to Pieces Without Falling Apart, and so on. So he's another one, a psychiatrist or psychologist plus a Buddhist meditator and teacher.
And a Jew.
And a Jew, yeah. All these.
The UD.
And so in this article, which was written quite a long time ago, he, I can email it to you. I'll email it to Tal and then you can send it. Yeah, he talks about different kinds of, like in psychology or psychotherapy, there's certain empty experiences of emptiness, which are actually pathological. They're not healthy at all. But if people don't know it, they can be in one of these states and think this is Buddhist emptiness. So this is what he's talking about in that article. So it's quite interesting.
בעברית זה בין ריק לריקות.
להתרוקנות. מה? התרוקנות, ריקות
לא, ריקות זה emptiness, וריק זה avoid כזה, psychological void.
So even to use the word emptiness can be confusing.
Yeah.
It sounds like, ooh, nothingness. Nothingness. Yeah,
No,
but that is...
Emptiness is just the beginning of the sentence.
Yeah.
It's emptiness of...
inherent existence.
Exactly.
Yeah. But sometimes they do just say emptiness, emptiness, emptiness. And if you don't have a good understanding, that's why it's so important to really study, get good teachings from good teachers. I'm not saying I'm a good teacher, but I have studied with good teachers. I've had teachings from wonderful teachers, and so I feel like I have a, more or less, at least an intellectual understanding of emptiness. But when it comes to the experience of emptiness, I still have a long way to go. So, any other questions?
Can you say again the name of the guy? You said Jack Engler?
Engler. E-N...
Jack?
E-N-G-L-E-R.
Ah, Engler.
So, it's just, I can send that article. It's a little bit long, but that's interesting. The one by Mark Epstein is shorter. It's only a couple of pages and relatively easy.
I have something like small, but I find from my own experience that I started learning with the tenets, not with...
With
I
what?
started learning the tenets.
Tenets.
And not practice or Buddhism, because this is how it came here to be. And I found that the tenets helped me get a more strong, what you said, feeling of security. So sort of, it sort of cuts by learning the tenets. It cuts many habits and afflicted emotions. That's what it did to me. And then in a certain place, you get stronger to go on with further teachings of Buddhism. So I think it depends also on your teachers and how you study, what it can evolve, how it evolves with your own personal perception. I don't know exactly what.
Yeah, I mean the monasteries, the Gelugpa monasteries anyway, they start off learning Dura, like all the different kinds of phenomena and debating, and then they learn Lorig, all the different kinds of mind, and then they learn tenets, the different schools. And it's only much later that they really go into emptiness, you know, after so many other years. And then the big subject they study, they call it Parchen, or perfections, and it's the Abhisamayalankara. You usually study that for 6 or 7 years. And that explains the whole Bodhisattva's path, all the things that the Bodhisattva does. I mean, it's so beautiful. So they do all of that first. So again, I think that would really reinforce a sense of, oh, I have this possibility, I have this body and mind and Buddha nature, and I can become enlightened. So I think you would have quite a strong sense of, before then going on to emptiness.
It's in the basic program, this subject? This subject, Parchen, is in the basic program?
No, master's program.
In the master's also?
Not in the basic program.
I started to learn it with Josh, and then everybody ran away.
Well, Geshe Kelsang Mama was teaching it in Dharamsala, but I don't know if she finished it, because I heard His Holiness asked her to do Pramanavartika, another one. But I think Gila was following it. Do you know Gila?
Yeah, some of us know.
Yeah. Because I think Gila was also accumulating notes and translating them into Hebrew of all the teachings she was getting. I don't know if she's still doing that or not. But
you should see her copybooks.
Huh?
Her copybooks is like with hieroglyphs. It's very, very, very small and full of knowledge. It's incredible. If somebody would ever sit and, type it, that would be a...
She never has really the time to go over the books and to take them out. That's
she
why
keeps accumulating more and more all the time.
She does a lot of things, but she doesn't have the time to do all the things she can do.
Somebody should take it on themselves.
Gila is an Israeli woman that's been living in Dharamsala for many, many years.
Maybe 17, 18 years, maybe.
I think she's one of the first Israelis to take an interest in Buddhism. So thank you.
Thank you.